Bard, Ovate and Druid. What is a bard? In ancient times the bards were the keepers of tradition, of the memory of the tribe. They were the custodians of the sacredness of the word. Although they probably represented the first level of training for an apprentice druid, we should not make the mistake of thinking that a bard was somehow in a lowly or inferior position. There were many levels of accomplishment, but the most skilled of bards were held in high esteem and partook of many of the functions of both the Ovate and the Druid. The training of a bard was intense and lasted for many years. There were variations in the curricula between Scotland, Ireland and Wales. In Ireland it is recorded that the training lasted 12 years, with students undergoing the following rigorous curriculum. In the first year, the student progressed from principal beginner, Alair, to poet's attendant, Tamhan, to apprentice satirist, Drissac. During this time, they had to learn the basics of the bardic arts, grammar, 20 stories, and the Ogham tree alphabet. Over the next 4 years, they learned a further 10 stories each year, 100 Ogham combinations, a dozen philosophy lessons, and an unspecified number of poems. They also studied diphthongal combinations, the law of privileges, and the uses of grammar. By their 6th year the student, if they had stayed the course, was called a pillar, CLI, and would study a further 48 poems and 20 more stories. Over the following 3 years, they were termed a noble stream, Anruth, because a stream of pleasing praise issues from him, and a stream of wealth to him. During this time, they learned a further 95 tales, bringing their repertoire up to 175 stories. They studied prosody, glosses, prophetic invocation, the styles of poetic composition, specific poetic forms, and the place name stories of Ireland. The final 3 years of their training entitled them to become an alum, or doctor, of poetry. In their 10th year, the student had studied further poetic forms and composition, in their 11th year 100 poems, and in their 12th year 120 orations, and the 4 arts of poetry. He or she was now the master or mistress of 350 stories in all. As alum, doctor of poetry, they were entitled to receive a gold branch. As Anruth, noble stream, they had carried a silver branch, and before that, throughout their training, they had carried a bronze branch. These branches had bells attached to them, so that as the poet strode into the hall, to recite a poem or tell a tale, they would be accompanied by the sound of bells, warning the audience to become silent, and summoning the help of the inner realms to ensoul their poem or story. In Wales and Scotland, the training of a bard was similarly rigorous, although with different grades and a different curriculum. What is an ovate? To you alone it is given to know the truth about the gods and deities of the sky. The innermost groves of far-off forests are your abodes. And it is you who say that the shades of the dead seek not the silent land of Erebus and the pale halls of Pluto. Rather, you tell us that the same spirit has a body again elsewhere, and that death, if what you sing is true, is but the midpoint of long life. Lucan Pharsalia c.60 CE. Lucan, in the above quotation, is addressing Druids generally, but it is an appropriate quotation to open our study of the Ovates. For it was they who, to the greatest degree, were responsible for understanding the mysteries of death and rebirth, for transcending time, for divining the future, for conversing with the ancestors, traveling beyond the grave to bring augury and counsel to those still living on earth. If the bards were shamans in Michael Harner's understanding of the term, because they opened doors with the power of the word, then the Ovates deserve the term shaman even more so, for they open the doors of time. From a study of the classical authors, a general categorization of the 3 different grades accords the arts to the bards, the skills of prophecy and divination to the Ovates, and philosophical, teaching, counseling, and judicial tasks to the Druid. The Ovates, then, were seers and diviners, travelers in time, and it seems likely that they were also healers, herbalists, and midwives. The English word ovate comes from the various terms used by the classical writers, vates, euades, euages, which may derive from the Indo-European root yut, to be inspired or possess. The classical author Strabo described the ovate as an interpreter of nature. It was the Ovates who were skilled in reading omens and divining auguries, whether from the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, or the behavior of animals or the weather, and it was the Ovates whose task it probably was to heal, using their knowledge of herbs and spells to cure disease in humans and livestock. The Ovate seems, in many ways, to conform to the type of person most people would describe as a witch, and it is certainly possible that when Druidry went underground with the coming of Christianity, the Ovate stream may have become a source that fed later generations of healers and followers of the old ways, until they came to be known as the cunning folk, healers who could still be found in villages in Britain up until the 1930s. And it is quite possible that these cunning people were in fact the witches of modern popular perception. The Ovate as master or mistress of prophecy and divination needed, and still needs today, a reorientation in relation to time. To travel within time, to read the Akashic records as some would term it, requires a conception of its nature and dynamics that is radically different to post-Enlightenment thinking, and more akin to the understanding now being offered by the new physics. The belief in the cyclicity of life was fundamental to the worldview of the ancient Druids. In common with the Hindus, the Druids believed in reincarnation. Caesar, in De Bello Gallico says of the Druids, the cardinal doctrine which they seek to teach is that souls do not die, but after death pass from one to another, and this belief, as the fear of death is thereby cast aside, they hold to be the greatest invective to valor. Diodorus quotes Posidonius when he says that the Druids held that the souls of men are immortal, and that after a definite number of years they live a second life when the soul passes to another body. And Philostratus of Tyana in the 2nd century noted that the Celts believed that to be born in this world, we have to die in the other world, and conversely, that when we die here, our birth into the other world should be celebrated. Now we can understand how the Ovates were able to conceive of time travel. The realm of the ancestors was not the realm of people dead and gone, it was the repository of tribal wisdom, the realm in which the ancestors lived whilst awaiting reincarnation and to which the Ovate could turn for guidance and inspiration on behalf of the tribe. The experience of the shaman is one in which they undergo some type of death, but return to life, only this time knowing the inner soul geography. In the past, this experience of returning to life from the realm of death was a rare occurrence. Today, with sophisticated techniques for reviving the body, the experience is becoming more frequent. A growing academic interest in the subject means that we now have an enormous amount of data on these near-death experiences. Out of the thousands of such experiences recorded, a clear pattern of experience emerges. The dying person experiences cracking, clicking, or rushing noises, or sometimes wonderfully harmonious sounds. This is followed by an experience of leaving the physical body, observing their physical body and surroundings from a distance. They then feel themselves drawn through a dark tunnel out of which they emerge into brilliant light. This light assumes an almost personal quality, and frequently encounters occur with spiritual helpers or protective beings, and the ancestors, friends and relatives who have died previously. There then often follows a rapid review of their life in which they realize instantly where they acted rightly or wrongly. This experience of self-judgment is followed by an entry into a state of being in which past, present and future merge into one reality, a world filled with ecstasy, radiant colors, and immensely beautiful landscapes. We know nothing more, with such certainty, of the post-death state, for those who reach this realm of beauty are then brought to a being who tells them that they must return to their body. Their visit, this time, has been only temporary. What is a Druid? Often when the combatants are ranged face to face, and swords are drawn and spears bristling, these men come between the armies and stay the battle, just as wild beasts are sometimes held spellbound. Thus even among the most savage barbarians anger yields to wisdom, and Mars is shamed before the Muses. Diodorus Siculus Histories, c.8 BCE. The reason we tend to visualize the Druid as an old man in our imagination is partly due, perhaps, to a realization that by the time one has undertaken the training of Bard and Ovate one is bound to be ancient. We cannot be sure of the exact time it took, but Caesar mentions that some spent as long as 20 years in their education at Druid colleges. But this is really little different to the time young people now take to complete their education, and Caesar's account is reminiscent of the situation of monastic schools in Europe and as far afield as Tibet, where young people would go or be sent for a complete education, free from the burden of taxation or military service, and instigated by such advantages, many resort to their school even of their own accord, whilst others are sent by their parents and relations. Commentators point out that 20 years could have been a figure of speech to denote a long duration of time, or that it might have actually been 19 years, since the Druids almost certainly used the Metonic cycle, a method of reckoning based on the 19-year eclipse cycle. If the bard was the poet and musician, the preserver of lore, the inspirer and entertainer, and the ovate was the doctor, detective, diviner and seer, what was the druid? Their functions, simply stated, were to act as advisor to rulers, as judge, as teacher, and as an authority in matters of worship and ceremony. The picture this paints is of mature wisdom, of official position and privilege, and of roles which involved decision-making, direction, and the imparting of knowledge and wise counsel. We tend to think of the druid as a sort of priest, but this is not borne out by the evidence. The classical texts refer to them more as philosophers than priests. At first, this appears confusing since we know they presided at ceremonies, but if we understand that Druidry was a natural, earth religion as opposed to a revealed religion, such as Christianity or Islam, we can see that the Druids probably acted not as mediators of divinity, but as directors of ritual, guiding and containing the rites. In addition to this, we know that they fulfilled a number of other functions, which we shall now examine. Separating these out is for the sake of convenience only, for in reality the roles often merged and combined, as we realize when Caesar tells us they have many discussions as touching the stars and their movement, the size of the universe and of the earth, the order of nature, the strength and the powers of the immortal gods, and hand down their lore to the young men. Here we see the Druids as scientists, as astronomers and mathematicians, as philosophers discussing the powers of the gods, and as teachers passing on their wisdom.